how many of you like to eat apples? You like to eat apples? My favorite is Granny Smith apple because I love the sourness of the crisp. I think everybody tells me, well, that's because of your personality. You're sour, you're critical. I said, I don't know. I like tart things instead of sweet things. But you know what? There was a man who was eaten by an apple tree. Look at this picture that's up here on the screen. Look at that picture. How many of you know who Roger Williams is? Anybody know? Yeah, he was the founder of what colony? In Rhode Island, right. So he was, for a short period of time, he was a Baptist. So he was a good guy, okay? We can say that, as a Baptist church. But he was a Baptist. But, during the time of the colonies, if you were not congregational and you decided to go off and worship in your own different way, in your own different church, you were persecuted. So he decided to start Rhode Island, which was a colony where people could come and where they could worship God in their own way, however they wanted to do, which is the reason why a lot of people came from England in the first place to America. So that's what we see. So Roger Williams, he was the founder of Rhode Island, and he was the main guy. But when he died, what they ended up doing is they ended up burying him in the backyard of John Brown, the founder of Brown University. And it wasn't a lot of fanfare, whatever it may be, but there was an apple tree there as well. So about 200 years later in 1860, the town of Providence wanted to get together and give him a proper burial place, to give him a big shrine to, this is the founder of our state. So they go to John Brown's backyard, and they weren't exactly sure where he was buried, but they began to dig, and they found some greasy earth. It was a hint that a body had been there. And then they found something else. They found a tree root. And this tree root looked as if it had taken on the form of Roger Williams. It had traveled the length of Williams' body, splitting at the hips, bending at the knees, and turning up at the feet. So what we see is that while this apple tree was growing, it feasted upon the decaying body of Roger Williams. Kind of gross, isn't it? Just think about the Brown family and the generations of the Brown family that went in the backyard and picked an apple and ate the apple from the tree that feasted on Roger Williams. Ooh. We kind of think about it's kind of morbid as we think about that. But then we ask the question, well, if the tree that ate Roger Williams provided apples that other people ate, the nutrients and the atoms and the carbons and all this is no longer there. So how will Roger Williams be resurrected? That's the question. And we have questions like that, don't we? How will babies who die before they are born, or babies who are aborted, how will they be resurrected? Or maybe you, in your family, or maybe you have a child who died young, or a family member who died in their 20s or 30s. Will they be resurrected in their 20s or 30s? Well, what about if I had a family member that lived to be 96? How will she be resurrected? Will she be 96 when she's resurrected, or will she go in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s? What is the perfect glorified age? They always say the 50s are the new 40s, and so on and so forth. What is the perfect? What age will our bodies be when we are resurrected? What about those who were buried at sea? Eaten by fish. And those fish were eaten by other fish, and those fish were eaten by other fish. And maybe even caught, and humans ate those fish. The body parts are not together. How is God going to resurrect them if they're not together? What about those who have been buried for thousands of years? They are nothing but dust. How will God resurrect them? Not only that, but what if we're still living? How will we be changed? So over the next 2 weeks, this week we're going to be talking about the resurrection body, and next week we're going to be talking about how the resurrection happens. But it's exactly what we see. In this passage, Paul answers two questions. He says, but if anyone will ask, how are the dead raised, and what kind of the body do they come? Paul is answering the how question, how does resurrection happen, and the what question, what type of body will we have when we are resurrected? These are questions that the Corinthian church had. These are questions I think every Christian have had over the past decades. And I think these are questions we have as well. What type of body, what is the resurrection going to be like? So I think what we see is this can be divided up in two different things. Number one, we see the requirement for resurrection. What is required for the resurrection? And secondly, what is basically the results of the resurrection? What are our bodies going to be like once they are resurrected? So look with me at verse 36. He starts off and says, you foolish person. Now, he's not making fun of those that question us. I think, you ever heard of, has your teacher ever said there's no stupid question? The only stupid question is the unasked question? He's not making fun of those who are questioning. He's basically saying foolish, saying that, hey, you have those questions, but just wait. Look around. God's creation tells us exactly the answer to both of these questions. So Paul begins to look at creation and says, this is how God's going to work. And he uses these illustrations as we go down, as these young ladies read. And, I've read this at funerals before, and it's a lot of things that he talks about. He goes on and on and on. So sometimes it's hard to do that. So we're going to try to make this very attainable today. But Paul is answering these questions to correct two common errors. Number one is that the resurrection body will be identical to the one that was buried. So that's not true. That body will be different. And the number two fallacy that he's answering here today is that the resurrection body will be completely unrelated to the original. So those are the two things here. So what is necessary for resurrection? First, we see that death is necessary. Death is necessary. He goes on and says in verse 36, you foolish, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel perhaps of wheat or of other grain. But God gives a body as he has chosen, and to each of the seed its own body. So Paul sits here and says, our resurrection is going to be like a seed planted in the ground. Now, most of you here understand what a seed is. This past week, we spent several days in our yard preparing for the first mow. During the past few months, we had those big windstorms that came through. Well, for some reason, our pine trees decided in that windstorm to give up all their pine cones. So there were thousands of pine cones all dropped to the ground all at once. So instead of just dropping down underneath them, they were blown, 30, 40 feet away from the trees. So what we did is that I think we picked up thousands and thousands of pine cones. But you think about it, you look at a pine cone and you look at a pine tree. Are they the same? No. So what happens is that you put the pine cone and you bury it, or it's buried into the ground. And that pine cone decomposes. The outer shell that protects it decomposes, and from that shell comes a plant that grows into a tree. But what happens is that there must be decomposition. There must be death before there is resurrection. And that's a necessary thing. Every seed is to be put into the ground, and it dies, it decomposes. And from that, a plant arises. a very different kind of body than the seed. And it's the same what Paul is saying to us. Just as that seed is planted, that seed must decompose, that seed must be put into the ground. So it is with us. That for resurrection to happen, death must happen as well. You know, we could basically form an axiom basically saying that nothing that has never died shall ever be raised from the dead. So the Corinthian church was worried that their family members or loved one had died and in Christ, and it's been a couple years, and yet they're still in the ground. What's going to happen? Paul is reassuring them and saying that death was necessary, because for resurrection to happen, death must be first come. But also we see that from that death, God changes the body. It is different yet the same. It's an oxymoron, right? Our bodies will be different but also the same. And of course, take the seed. The pine cone put into the ground doesn't grow up to be a bigger pine cone, does it? No. So you don't have like this, big pine cone just sitting there. No. It grows up into a tree. So it's different in volume and character. The pine cone has spines and is a little small and triangle eyes. The pine tree has green, evergreen leaves, and it also has bark and something else like that, and grows and grows and grows. It's a lot larger. Think about an acorn. Small little acorn. And when you plant an acorn, what type of tree do you get? Anybody know? An oak tree. And it's huge. It's different. And my favorite growing up, we always had maple trees in our yards. And I always hated them. Because you know what a maple seed looks like? It has a little seed and it has this long little thing that spins in the air. Well, they do that because they want it to spin and to grow someplace else. But you know where all those always landed? In our gutters, that's right. So it was my job growing up in all the different pine trees. I had to get up, and I'm just thankful we lived in a one-story house. Get up and clean out all those every summer. But that little spinny thing looks a lot different than the maple tree that grows up. But it's the same. The genetic material is the same, because that little seed will grow into a tree that will produce a seed just like it. The pine tree will produce a pine cone with the same genetic makeup. A pine tree is not going to produce an acorn, is it? No. So that's what we see. That's what Paul says, is that we're going to be changed to be different yet the same. So when we die, we are put into the grave. We will decompose and we will wait. That body will wait. Not us, but that body will wait until the second coming of Christ to be resurrected. And what we see is that body will be different, but yet it will be somewhat the same. So the idea of sameness. So for now, resurrection will happen. But before that happens, we must die, and then we are changed. That's what he's talking about, verses 36 through 38. And then what is the result of the resurrection? What happens when we are resurrected? God does it. We already see it happening before our eyes every single year. Spring, we plant the seed. In summer, we see the plant grow. And then we see in the fall, we harvest what we see, and we see the seed again. But we see the result of the resurrection. Look at verse 39. For all flesh is not the same, but there is one kind of flesh for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. Aren't you glad, women, that your husband don't have scales like an alligator? Aren't you glad? It's not very fun to cuddle an alligator, is it? Or how many of you women like snakes? Yeah, okay, there's always one weird one. There's always one weird one, and it doesn't matter what animal, you love whatever animal. But would you like to cozy up with the snake? Oh, ugh. How about a fish? Women who have fishermen, they stink. They're slimy, right? Birds. My wife hates birds. She won't go into those little arboretums, whatever they're called. You go to a thing, she's like, no, 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 no. We have soft human skin. The birds have feathers. The reptiles have scaly skin. Mammals and fish, they're all slimy. We all have different types of skin, and so we can go into nature and begin to see what our bodies are going to be like. The result of it is that our bodies will be diverse yet distinguishable. Are diverse yet distinguishable. We're going into, it's going to be different. But yet, the idea of sameness is there. Even if you go outside at night and look up in the sky, what do you see? Stars. Now, to the untrained eye, they all look the same pretty much, right? But you get into a telescope, and to someone that is trained, you can see the differences. They have different temperatures, therefore they have different colors. They're different sizes. Our sun doesn't look like a star because we're so close to it. The sun and the moon are heavenly planets or whatever. They're heavenly bodies, but they're different. So what Paul is saying here is that our resurrected body, we're going to be diverse. We're not all going to be spiritual clones. So we're not all going to be raised, and we're not going to get our wings. We're not transferred into angels or anything else, but we will all be resurrected into perfected bodies that will be different and will be distinguishable. We will know. Because just as we are unique here on earth, I think our resurrected bodies will be unique as well. We're not going to be cookie-cutter clones. One body will differ from the other in eternity. We'll be diverse. And I think there's also this idea that there's a possibility that in the resurrection, we will not only be unique bodily, but our personalities will be unique as well. Think about our personalities. We're all different, right? Opposites attract, don't they? Most of the time, husband and wife are not the same in personality. Every once in a while, that's not true. We're different. That, early on in life, that difference is what we loved about that spouse. But as we grow older, that difference is what annoys us the most about each other, right? But think about that. Think about how we're going to be resurrected. Our bodies will be distinguishable. We'll be diverse. We're not all going to be the same. It won't be the same body. But I think we can sit there and see what Paul is saying here is that our personality will be preserved forever in perfection. Now, our personality traits that are infected by sin will be glorified. So maybe you will no longer be the cranky person, or no longer will we always be pessimistic. But what we see is, I think that what Paul is saying here in our resurrected bodies is that we'll be distinguishable not only in bodily form, but also in personality. Just as you are now, some of that will also be present in eternity. And there's always that question, will we recognize each other? Will I recognize my mate, my spouse? Will my mom recognize me? Will my grandmother recognize me? My grandfather recognized me when I go to heaven. My father passed away at a very early age. I don't think that they're there waiting for us at the pearly gates, we could say. Now, we're going to talk about what it means. Next week, we're going to talk about the time when we die and we're awaiting resurrection, what happens then. We're going to deal with that a little bit. But I think what happens is that when we do die, that we will be recognizable. Not because we knew them before, but because we will know, because we are known. We will have perfect knowledge of many things. So we're going to be different, but yet the same. Our bodies will be glorified, will be perfected, but yet they will be the same. Our personalities, I think, will be distinguishable as we go there, but yet they'll be different, but yet the same. Not only that, but our bodies will be drastically different. Drastically different. Benjamin Franklin wrote, when he was young, wrote an epitaph. And he read this way, and I think it wonderfully catches exactly what Paul is saying here in these verses here at the last part of our text that we're looking at here, in verses 42 through 44. And he wrote this, and he says, "The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, it will appear once more in a new, elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author." And I think at the resurrection, everything that has been wrong with us, everything that has marred the image of God inside of us because of sin, will be corrected, will be perfected. And that's what Paul is saying here in verses 42 through 44. He uses 4 clauses, each repeating the verbs, "it is sown," and then later on, "it is risen." So he says that our old bodies will be sown, our old bodies will be buried. But then when Christ comes and we are resurrected to a new type of body, a drastically different body. And he does this 4 times. So the first is that when we are resurrected, there will be no more sickness and death. The imperishable. So we will be sown perishable, and we will rise imperishable. Imperishable. The King James Version used to say sown in corruption, raised in incorruption. Because of sin, not only was there spiritual death, but there was also physical death. So from the time that we are born, we are heading closer and closer to that date that is written in the book of God, in the book of life of our death. That yes, we can be born healthy, but as we grow older, we get sicker because of sin. And so what happens is that when we perish, whether from sickness, whether from old age, or whether from an accident, we see that we have a body that is riddled with sickness and heading towards death. But what we see is that we were raised in a body that is imperishable, indestructible. There will be no more sickness and no more death. Think about that. No more COVID. Aren't you tired of COVID? No more COVID, no more colds, no more eyeglasses, no more stubbed toes, no more achy joints as we get up in the morning, no more cancer, no more disease, no more death. We are sown perishable, but we rise imperishable. Secondly, we are sown in verse 43. The body is sown in dishonor, and it is raised in glory. There will be no more shame because of sin. No more shame. You see, we have this idea that the dishonor of sin has brought death and taintedness of the image of God in our body. And because of sin, we have shame. Sin is coming, and it will ultimately bring dishonor to us. So not only is the physical consequence of sin reversed, but the spiritual consequence of sin is reversed as well. We are raised to glory. We are glorified. We are perfected. No longer is the stain or the taint of sin in our life. We will never have that. Because what happens in Romans 8, Paul says, whom he has chosen, he justified, and whom he has justified, he is glorified. When we come out of the grave, there will no longer be shame. There will no longer be consequences of sin. And there will no longer be dishonor, but glory. Full human glory. Then we go on and we see that there'll be no more failing in temptation. No more failing in temptation. At the end of verse 43, it says, "It is sown in weakness and is raised in power." It is sown in weakness and it is raised in power. We are weak people. Think about that. Probably one of the biggest industries in America is the medical industry. Why? Because we are weak. It doesn't take long going to a hospital, going to a nursing home to see that we are physically, as we grow older, weaker because of sin. But it's not only that, but we are weak spiritually as well. You see, the great thing is, is that when we are saved, God justifies us and He releases us from the penalty of sin, which is God's wrath. So when we are saved, we escape the penalty of sin. So we no longer carry that burden because God put it upon the cross. He put it upon Christ, and Christ took that penalty for us. And also when we are saved, God sanctifies us. Little by little, day after day, month after month, year after year, we become less and less entrenched to our sin and more like Christ. So when we are saved, not only are we free from the penalty of sin, but we are free from the power of sin. No longer does sin have control over us. We have the ability to say no to temptation and to say yes to the way of Christ through the Holy Spirit. But the problem is that while we are here on earth, we are still in the presence of sin. And I've talked about this time and time again, that we still sin. Because sin is still present, we are still imperfected. And not only that, but we are still in the presence of people. We still feel the effects of not only our sin, but other people's sin. What does the resurrection do? What does the glorification, the perfection of the body do? It takes us away from the presence of sin in our life. When we are resurrected, when we are transformed, when Christ returns, we will no longer be in the presence of sin. We will be in the presence of His glory. That's what it means, that we will no longer deal with temptation. We will have the power. We are no longer weak. And then he goes on in verse 44, "It is sown as a natural body and it is raised as a spiritual body." Now that doesn't mean that, okay, we're physical now, and then all of a sudden that we're going to be some type of spirit. We're not going to be a ghost. We're not going to be ethereal. We're not going to be a mist for eternity. But what it means is that we will have a different type of a body. We will have a spiritual body. Right now we have a natural body. So we have a body that is made perfectly for where we live. How many of you have gills? No. And I know the people in Naboo and whatever that weird blue people they can breathe both air and in water. I guess the James Cameron movie that came out. I don't know what it was. But why don't we have gills? Because we were born to be above water. We were made perfectly for this sphere, suitable to live in what we have. So that's the natural man. Adam was created to live in the garden. We were created to live here. But sin has ruined that part, and that's the reason why we get sunburns. That's the reason why we have to have glasses we can't see at night, because of sin. But what happens is that when we are resurrected, we're going to get a body that is suitable to live in the presence of God forever, for eternity. So it's not a natural body, but it is a spiritual body. If you go on in verses 45 all the way to 49, it talks about, again, we talked about this a few weeks ago, Paul begins to compare and contrast Adam and Christ again. Adam, the first Adam, and Christ, the second Adam. Adam was the son of dust, the man of dust, the natural body. Christ was the man of heaven, the spiritual body. So what Paul is saying here is that we will no longer be limited by time and space. We will get a new body that is suitable for eternity. And what is our prototype? Our prototype here on earth was Adam, is what it's saying in verses 45 through 49. but our prototype for eternity is going to be Christ. Think about Christ's resurrected body. Was it physical? Who touched Christ's body? Thomas. It was physical. He could feel it. I think Mary Magdalene tried to hug Christ. Now, did Jesus eat with his disciples? Yes. So we know he's a Baptist because he still ate, So we know that because also his cousin was John the Baptist. So Jesus' body was a physical body. It wasn't spiritual. You didn't, Thomas' hands didn't go through it. It touched his fingers. It touched his side where the nails and the spear went through. And he walked and he talked and he was recognizable. But you know what else Jesus' body did? He went through walls. Now, I can't tell you for a shadow of a doubt that we'll have that power. If I try to go through the wall right now, what's going to happen? I could break my nose if I run and hit that wall. I'm not saying that once we die and resurrected that we're going to be able to go through walls. I don't know. Because where does Christ's humanness and deity, stop? Christ may have been able to go through a wall because he was God. Not only man, but God. Will we be able to do that? Martin Luther said that it'll be great where, in the heavens and the earth, the new heavens and the earth, that I'll be on earth one moment and I'll be able to float up to heaven on the next moment. Not at all limited about that. Whether or not that'll happen, we don't know. But we will have a different body, a drastic different body, and our prototype is Christ. So it's physical, but yet recognizable. Because everybody knew who Jesus was. The only people who did not know were those two disciples on the road of Emmaus, because Jesus hid his identity. So we have a body that's going to be sown in sin, but a body that will raise in perfection. So when we die, we will be raised. We're going to be built for a new world. Now we need to understand that we're going to be built for a new world suitable for eternity. If you know Christ, we're going to be built, and we're going to be built for the eternity to be present with God and the new heavens and the new earth for eternity. But if you do not know Christ, you're going to be built with a body that will not go into joy and hope in the presence of Christ, but you will be raised into the absence of God. And you will have a body that will pay for your sins for eternity, because Christ did not pay for your sins because you rejected the gospel. So very quickly, what are some implications of the resurrection? I know we're running late. So what are the implications of the resurrections? Number one is that our bodies should be valued. Our bodies should be valued. If we are going to live in a body forever that is similar yet different than us, our bodies here on earth are important and should be respected, should be valued. And I think what happens is that those here on earth, we fail in two areas, two extremes. We fall into two extremes. Number one, we sit there and we make an idol out of our body. You can see this all over social media, where everything we do is about how good our body looks, how perfect our body is. So we will do anything to get a perfect body and to show everyone that perfect body. That's all over Facebook. That's all over TikTok, all over Instagram. So you can fail by making too much of your body, by making it an idol. Or I think where we are as Christians a lot of times is that, we don't care. It's all about the spirit. It's all about our soul. So what we do is that we concentrate on our spiritual life and let our physical life go to pot. And I think this is shown in the leadership of the churches in America. What is the number one unhealthy segment job in America? The unhealthiest people in America are pastors. And that, I think it's because we have a fallacy that the physical doesn't matter. And it does. If we're going to live in a physical body for eternity, if God cares about our body on the other side of death, wouldn't he say that we should care about our bodies on this side of death? And I think that also, so what we see is that we need to respect how God formed us, how God made us. God's purpose for me was set. There was no mistake that I was born on September 16th, 1976 in Wichita Falls, Texas, to both Fred and Sherry Helton. And I was born as a male. That was not an accident. That was not by happenstance. It just wasn't by coincidence. It was part of God's plan. And we need to respect how God has created us, how God has brought us from the womb. We don't need to just respect life, but we need to respect that body that has been brought with life. I think what we see today, that abortion is just an affront on the image of God, but this idea of transgenderism, what we've been talking about in His image, is just as much as an affront, a stain, a disdain for the image of God as He created us. We should respect how God has created us. And yes, sin will affect our bodies and will affect how we look at our bodies. But that does not mean that we should forget the body. Our body is not a prison for our soul. And then once we die, we live eternally as a spirit. No, that's not what Paul's saying. Paul says, yes, there is spirit and there is the body. The body will go to the grave, but will be resurrected, and we need to respect that. And also we see that cremation, I think, is not unbiblical. So I need to make sure cremation is not unbiblical. More and more today, we see questions is it okay for cremation? And every time I do a funeral, I always ask the guys that are there and says, what are you seeing in this change? He says, outside of the rural areas, cremation is probably going to be the majority of way that we bury people in the near future. The rural areas are still heavenly where we bury a body. But think about that. And the Bible doesn't say either way. And you can practice cremation and still respect the life and the body that is there. You think about that. If God created us out of dust, then He can resurrect us out of dust as well. Cremation just speeds up the process of our bodies returning to dust. Cremation does not hinder God's plan of resurrection. But I also want to look at this, not only the implications, but look at the irony. The resurrection is ironic. It's ironic. Jesus, the man of heaven, took on the body of dust in order that people who are made of dust might take on a heavenly body. Jesus, the imperishable, became the perishable so that the perishable may become imperishable. Jesus, the glorious one, experienced dishonor so the dishonorable may experience glory. Jesus, the powerful one, became weak so that the weak ones could experience power. Jesus, who deserved life, experienced death, so those who deserved death could experience life, new life. Jesus, the man of heaven, made Himself the Son of Man, a man of the earth, so that the sons of Adam, men of the earth, might become the men of heaven. In Jesus, the natural, the supernatural come together. In Jesus, the spiritual and the physical come together. And here's the encouragement as I want to live before we sing our final hymn, is if you belong to Jesus, His or your future of supernatural resurrection is as certain as your present body today. You can guarantee that you will be raised from the dead. Why? Because we are physical today. We will be physical for eternity. My question is that how will you want to live your life? With Christ or without Christ? How you live your life will be how you spend eternity, with Christ or without Christ. I think there are 4 things that are certain for every human being here on earth: birth, death, resurrection, and taxes. There's nothing that, if everybody who's living today will experience those 4 things, we can't get away from it. And that's a reminder that if you haven't done your taxes, you have a couple more days. But we will all experience resurrection. Or if we're still living, we will experience transformation. And we'll be transformed to be suitable to live either away from God or with God. And if you're here today and you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, if you're not living for Christ today, then don't expect that when you die and are resurrected that you will live with Christ forever. Your decision on whom you serve here while you're alive dictates on where you will spend eternity, either with Christ or without Christ. But see, we can have hope because of the resurrection.